Good to see you all. Should be live here in just a moment. There we go. Yeah, that's true, Miro. I don't think most wives would. Of course, some women get abused to the point where they can't do anything, and it becomes a syndrome, basically, right? And they have a hard time breaking free from that kind of abuse. But then there's, so there's actual physical abuse of a person, right? Where you're like striking them and hurting them physically apart from a sex act. And then there are sex acts that are themselves damaging to the person, right? And so also, like striking them, a form of abuse that one person is doing for their enjoyment and satisfaction at the expense of someone else, even if the other person's willing, right? So you can see on the thumbnail, right? I know. Welcome to CWJah Talk 49, everyone. Fornication in the Bible. We've done several videos about subjects involving different types of sexuals, right? We did an early CWJah Talk show about heterosexuals, homosexuals, and others. I've done several videos about the LGBTQ community, homos in general, and also things like sodomy, right? We got a couple sodomy videos. Let's talk sodomy, because the Bible is where that term and practice first appears. And we have people today doing the same things, and so we see them as, and they've even called themselves, right? Stephen Colbert addressing people at one of the Academy Award shows. Guy said, "Welcome sodomites," right? So they know who they are. They don't always like it though, right? They hate it when you call them on that. But we want to talk today, and in this show, CWJah Talk show, it's a little more structured, a little more formal. We stay to the topic, right? Very unlikely I'll be able to interact with a lot of questions, although I am live and I will try to. But I have material I want to cover as part of this show for you to consider. Put whatever you want in the chat as long as it relates, or in the comments below, and we can discuss it as long as it's appropriate. And so we've recently done a couple videos on polygamy, and in my Christian Witnesses of Jah live discussion 18 yesterday, I did kind of a polygamy, does the New Testament prohibit polygamy 2.5, that I will cut and upload later to complement the other two videos I did by that title. But I'm also going to do this video now. We're going to talk about fornication in the Bible. Pretty much every reference to it in the Old and New Testaments. Some that aren't, there's some we're not going to read because they just say fornication without much context or anything. And so they're not worth spending time on like the others that present the same wording in a context where it's further described. We're also going to define the term here in a moment. And then next Sunday, I'm going to do a show, CWJah Talk number 50. What is adultery? Or I'm sorry, adultery in the Bible. I apologize. But it'll basically be that question. We're going to answer that. What is it in the Bible? What does the Bible say? They talked about a little bit in some of the Does the New Testament Prohibit Polygamy videos. But we're going to focus, just like we are today with fornication, on adultery next Sunday, so that we understand and we're prepared. We can properly manage ourselves and deal with situations, help others do the same, not overreact, not underreact. Let's get the perspective from the Bible so that we can all refer to it and say, okay, yeah, well, we reviewed that and this is what it says or doesn't say. If I miss something, or if there's something I don't cover today, feel free to bring it up. I've done my best to put together as comprehensive of a discussion for us so that we can see very clearly from the Old to the New Testament what is fornication. And so we'll get started in just a second here. I'll give people a couple minutes, as I usually do with the live streams, and then I'll formally reintroduce the show as CWJah Talk 49, probably in a couple minutes, and then we'll get started, okay? But we always have a little pre-show and these live shows, and just to let people join if they're available, say hi, and, sometimes things come up that are worth keeping. Otherwise, maybe I'll clip it later and we'll have a formal introduction. Because these shows on the CWJah Talk series, at least that was the plan, was to have them a little more formal, a little more structured and tight, and so there's not as much interaction like we did yesterday. But the pre-show kind of gives me a chance to do that. And I'll say hello to everybody here in just a second. Of course, I saw Miro. Miro was here first. Good to see you, Miro. It's a little early, I know. I have things that are coming up a little later. We usually do shows around 8 o'clock California time, sometimes earlier. But this time has been kind of working out better for me. So I do the best I can to put up notifications. I recommend you subscribe and hit the bell if you're wanting to know when exactly are we going to meet live this week. We usually meet once or twice a week, for sure every Saturday, except on rare occasions. So I welcome you to join us. Okay, so we got some good stuff here. I hope you're all ready. Ready to be blown away? I'm kidding. Nothing new. I think, for the most part, you're going to see things basically as you probably understand them right now, only there's a lot more to it. And this question of men and how many women you can have, as we've been talking about in some of our shows, we just look at the Bible, right? So when you do that, if your goal is to understand what is written in these records, you can do that. I think there's no problem doing that. What happens is, like with most things, traditions develop and don't really have the same weight as the original source they're supposed to be based on. And people get used to the traditions. And then when they look past them and to the source they're actually based on, and you see that they're not exactly what the source says, or, something you can enforce the way they are, like the way marriage is sometimes, between, in certain countries, one man and one woman. And if you were to have more than one woman married in the official sense, it would be against the law. So in these records, of course, other than in the New Testament, where you do get into this period where Rome had this law against polygamy or multiple wives, nonetheless, the Jews still practiced the law, certainly through the time of the destruction of the temple and thereafter, but became more difficult and in ways not as clearly defined as we have them in various sources like the Bible, related records, Josephus, and other sources, Roman sources, Greek sources, that at least give us some indication of the life of the Jews who were living according to the Bible at various times. So that's number one, right? Okay, we're going to start here. I'll just save it because I was about to get into some stuff I would say in the opening. But that's where we're going to go, right? We need to kind of look at what we think of today when it comes to adultery, fornication, these subjects we're talking about, and say, all right, are we consistent with what these records we say we follow are telling us? And if not, what kind of adjustment in our understanding is appropriate, is warranted? What do the facts show? How far should we be going with some of this stuff? That's really what we want to know, right? We don't want we all sin, right? And sexual sin is like the most common type, if not the most, probably the most common type. It's not good, but the idea that somehow this is bizarre is itself bizarre. And yet, it's strange to me how difficult it is to get past some of these, most common types of sinful behavior, or maybe not even sinful, as we're going to see, right? Behavior that is just not the same as it was at different times in history. And so to us, it's weird, it's unfamiliar, but that doesn't make it wrong, right? There are some things we can see are wrong because, like we were talking about earlier, and like Miro and I were talking about, they're abusive. They're bad for you. They damage each party, and they're, of course, in the biblical sense, not according to God's law. But the damage, if there's evident damage, and it's clearly, if God says this is the best way, or even if science says, hey, over time we've studied human relationships, this is the best way to have a happy, successful life, I guarantee you there's no sodomy involved in there, right? There's no abuse involved in this is the best way to have the happiest and most normal life, biblically or non. You can do various things that are a part of relationships, but you got to look at the act itself, right? Look at the thumbnail. We've got two homos and a female prostitute, it looks like, right? It's an image from Pompeii that was destroyed by Mount Vesuvius, of course, probably CWJah, right? You never know. I mean, we can't prove it, but it's a little bit interesting, the destruction in the area and the way. Either way, you can see there are two homos, right? You got one homo penetrating the other, and the other homo being penetrating the woman. And so you have double anal going on there, plus the homo element. That's all. Who's benefiting from that? We'll talk about it in a minute. But I wanted you to understand, right? I know the image. That's an actual art, though. And this is what I'm taught. This is a way to remember. What is fornication? What is porneia? What is it in the Old Testament sense that we're going to talk about and define? I think you can pretty clearly there's a range. There is definitely different types of fornication, even as we saw in our recent discussions on polygamy. 1 Corinthians 5, we'll read it briefly in a moment. Paul even recognized, hey, you guys are doing things beyond even the nations. And what I'm showing in the thumbnail is what the nations were doing. So, it's really, as you're going to see, the kind of things, fornication, these are not ever things that you can show have a benefit to people, right? Now, the Bible provides a basis for leaving a relationship that's abusive, as we're going to talk about tonight, showing that the Bible does not support this kind of overbearing, male-dominating, where you do every single thing I say, no matter what, and I don't care, and no, that's not the Bible. Okay? That may be people who claim to believe in the Bible or call themselves whatever. That's why we have these shows. That's why we go to the source. Okay, we're not here to let other people tell us what these things mean when we can find out for ourselves with a little study and determination. So with that in mind, let's say hi and get started, right? We're pumped up. A lot going on here. I know Miro, because I think he wasn't here last time. Who do we got here? We got Miro, okay? And we have Bankhead. Good to see you, Bankhead. Yeah. TKS, once again, good to see you. Exile Reviews. Exile Reviews, okay. Wonder if that's some kind of Watchtower thing. I don't know. We'll find out. I'm sure Exile will tell us. Don't worry, Watchtower people. We get the pro and the con here, and then you guys are always welcome. And we're talking about the Bible here. M. Garcia, good to see you. Just trying to make sure I don't miss anything. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Excuse me. A little drink right there. Sometimes, because I don't talk a lot audibly outside of these videos. It's just not required for my work necessarily, and I'm not walking around just talking all the time. So when I do these extended videos, and my throat can get a little dry, or just the extended talking, And I did get over like a little bronchial cold from a month ago. Kind of gave me a little lingering congestion, but nothing. It's all good. I feel very good. It's one of those things I noticed. A little bit change in voice too. Okay, let's go ahead and get started then. So let me put you guys here. We'll introduce the show and let's get going. We got stuff. I got some I think things that will hopefully help us better relate to each other, help each other, understand situations better, and not be judgmental where it's inappropriate, right? We want to help people. Yes, if there are things happening sinful and they're hurting the person, we should help or try to stop it or address it or make it known that, hey, we see a problem here. If the person doesn't want help, that's okay. Then we'll just treat them as a person. If someone wants to continue doing something and then claim there's something they're not, well, we try, and if we can't help, then we move on. But things like this, discussions like this, I think will help. I hope it at least benefits you in your understanding of these issues, and that you're better able as a result to help yourself and other people understand these concepts, right? What's fornication? Fornication in the Bible, right? We know. We've got other things. This here. And we'll close that. We're going to start in like 1 minute, everybody. This here. There we go. All right. So this is the pre-show. I'm about to start it. I'm going to just formally introduce it so that later, if I clip the pre-show, the opening from there to when I start, then it'll kind of just take off as the show on its own. Okay. Got that. Did I have 2 of those open? I did. That way I can go quickly to that. And quickly to that. Perfect. All this stuff, huh? It was a good show yesterday, too. I enjoyed talking to everybody. Thought that was fun. If you have not joined us for CW Christian Witness of Jah live discussion, I highly encourage you to do so. That's our Saturday evening, or depending on where you are, group fellowship. And, I know it may be hard, right? Especially for some who, like Watchtower people. Some of you don't like to be a part of what other fellowships are doing. But, I think some of you are getting used to it. And, hey, whenever you're ready to join us, you know where to find us. Or hopefully you can help someone else who may need assistance. Okay. We'll just use that. I wonder what that looks like. Let's check that, though. Right. One more thing right here. Let's make that a little bigger. I guess that's about as good, right? And you can always look this up and read it in your own translation. You prefer. Okay, here we go. You ready? I haven't had to do a CWJah talk in a few months. I want to get over 50, though. My goal was originally to do 100, at least of this series, and then see where it is at that point. We have these other things going on, right? So who knows what'll happen after that. But yeah, I'll stay with that. I'm going to do 100 at least of the CWJah talk shows. Here's number 49. Welcome to CWJah talk number 49. Fornication in the Bible. Fornication is a word you've heard for sure if you're an English speaker, or maybe even if you're not. And so the question we're going to be answering tonight is, what does the Bible have to say about it? What does this word that we're used to today, at least in English, as fornication, what does that mean in the Bible? What words are used in the Bible, in the Hebrew and Greek scriptures, that are similar to our English word fornication. Well, first, let's take a look at what our English word for fornication means, at least according to a popular online source. It's not meant to be the authority for English, but it is a very regularly used source for what common English terms mean, and it provides definitions from standard accepted sources. I'm talking about Google, of course. So let's just take a look, right? What is just the basic definition that everybody should know? Because if you're an English speaker, this is what it means. It's not like Google is providing all these different definitions, right? Not usually. It's usually pretty basic and standard and based on standard sources, which you can see right here from Merriam-Webster, two different religious sources, other dictionaries. Well, here it says at the top, right below my caption, let me see if I can make it a little bigger. Sexual intercourse between people not married to each other. Now, there might be something here in terms of what it means to be married to each other. We've been talking recently in some of our other videos on this channel about things like polygamy and what it means in the Bible for a man to have more than one woman. And we've discussed how in the Bible there's no requirement for what it means for you to be married. Like you have to have a ceremony, you have to have a ring. These are all later traditions. Some of them you can find. There are ceremonies and weddings in the Bible, but again, there's no requirement that this is what you have to do to be officially married. Very frequently, in the Old Testament, men would take a woman to their home, and they were part of their family, by whom they would then have children, and they were married. So, that aside, basically what it's telling us, at least in the common English that Google's presenting, definitions from these related sources, sexual intercourse between people not married. Okay, so if we just look at that in the sense in which I described the Bible, right, where marriage is basically a man taking a woman to his home and keeping her as part of his family, becoming one and having children. I think that is basically what you're going to see. Now, there is more to it. That's just basically what you're going to see. Over here, you can see Wikipedia gives a little definition, or Google gives it from Wikipedia, right? We're not going to get into it. It's not like these are like our standard sources. We're just taking a quick look at the common use of these terms in English and what they mean. Fornication is generally consensual sexual intercourse between two people not married to each other. When one or more of the partners having consensual sexual intercourse is married to another person, it is called adultery. Now, we're going to talk about adultery next Sunday. And I've talked about it a little bit again in my other videos on polygamy. And again, basically that is correct. But there's more to it. Also with adultery, right? Adultery requires you to leave the person you're with for someone else. Adultery is never in the Bible, like I've shown and will show again next Sunday. A man who has a woman he's taken into his home. It's never when a man who has a woman in his home takes another woman into his home to also be part of his family. That's never, not one single time, presented as adultery in the Bible. You know why? Because most people in the Old Testament, men, had more than one woman. From King David all the way down to your basic Hebrew or Israelite. So it wouldn't even make sense, would it? The idea that adultery means having, as it says here, in consensual sexual intercourse with another person when you're married to someone else. That really wouldn't be correct in the sense in which the Bible presents it, because a man like David, who has a wife and takes either another wife or a concubine, as he did, as I'll show you, that's not adultery. He's literally not only required to translate the law as king of Israel, but follow it, right? And even though he broke it at times, like everyone did except Jesus, that was not considered him breaking the law. When he took Uriah's wife, yes, because he took another man's wife. That's adultery. The woman belonged to Uriah, not to David. But taking another woman who doesn't belong to anyone, in addition to the woman who belongs to you, that's not adultery in the Bible. So this wouldn't be correct entirely. But in one sense, again, if you left the person, it doesn't really say that here in the Google Wikipedia definition, though. But if you left the other person for another person, that's adultery in the Bible. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but I wanted to at least show you, so I think fornication, for the most part, there's more to it, though. So I wouldn't agree with either one of these completely in terms of representing the Bible, but they do have a core agreement with the Bible. They just may have a different concept of what marriage is, and so that could be different. And then also, as you're going to see, one of the other things that is involved in the Bible when it comes to fornication, but not stated explicitly in these definitions, maybe it's in some other definitions, but I doubt it in this extended sense, it very often involves prostitution, harlotry. The having of sex that is abusive, which includes that harlotry and prostitution, because that is abusive. Harlots and prostitutes are abused. They may be happy for a while, I'm sure they are. Make a lot of money, you get help for a while, but over time, and even more immediately at times, the risks you're taking are unbelievable, right? Especially back then, but even so true today. We've got monkeypox, AIDS, HPV, HIV, all kinds of stuff. It's crazy. The idea that you can just prostitute yourself and have sexual intercourse with all these different people for money or some kind of exchange, as you'll see, that's damaging to you. That's not what the God of the Bible says, this is how I want you women to be. So it's an aberration. It's a perversion, an abusive perversion of sexuality. And this is where it's similar to this definition. In the prostitution harlotry sense, the harlot, the prostitute, doesn't come home with you, right? She doesn't, if she does, then she's either a concubine, which is like a non-wife, or like someone who's part of the family, but a second level wife almost, right? That's what concubines are. They're all throughout the Bible. Yeah. You women today, while that may be common when you think about it, in many ways, you actually do act quite similar to these ancient models. It just seems a little different, but when you break it down, it's really not much different. And when you look at the things that most of you are doing, like we talked about, right? And I'm not trying to pick on you, but let's be honest here. Most of you wear far more makeup and revealing clothes then probably you need to, right? It's not helping anybody. It's just making you feel better about yourself and making people notice you more when you're supposed to, as a woman, be helping men glorify the God of the Bible. He made you. He created you. He gives you all these things. You didn't give them to yourself. You didn't make them yourself. You're just taking advantage of them for yourself. And men sometimes do the same. Okay? But when it comes to prostitution, harlotry, and while you do have the male and female prostitution in the Bible and now, it's all abuse, right? As you're going to see. And is someone going to question that? Guys, I can pull up stats. I can show the consequences that come with repeated sexual intercourse with people you don't know. And then things like sodomy, right? As you see depicted on the thumbnail, right? You have an image of artwork there from Pompeii. It was totally wiped away or blown out by Mount Vesuvius. Whether you believe by Jah or not, right? They were taken out and the paintings were preserved to show what they were doing. And that's what was taking place in the first century. That's what areas of Rome, even though, it wasn't just because they didn't believe in more than one wife, that didn't mean they didn't allow sex with lower classes of individuals, and or didn't have these different brothels and things where they would have sex very commonly, but not have it be considered them having more than one wife, right? Just like we're talking about, basically. Although among Romans, that was illegal, and among Jews and Christians, it was not. In the New Testament, it was prohibited by Paul for overseers and servants, like we talked about, CWJah discussion number 18, and polygamy part 2, does the New Testament prohibit it? So, I think part 1 as well. It's important we keep in mind what we're talking about. Well, what are people thinking about? What is the standard definitions? What are they telling people these terms mean? Okay, are we reading back into the Bible something that's not there? Like I was kind of just talking about, right? Our view of marriage. Is that what the Bible talks about, the way we thinking about marriage? The idea of taking a woman into your home and her being part of your family, whether it was one wife or more, or even a concubine. In fact, let me just go ahead and bring up briefly the account that shows this is not unknown. This is very common, but I don't like to not cite anything when I bring up something important like this. Take a look. You haven't already, right? So the Bible, over and over again, all throughout the Old Testament, provides a basis for men having more than one woman as part of their family. It speaks against, as you're going to see, harlotry, prostitution, especially as it involves religious false god worship, but even not. Although there are exceptions that show a difference in ways that I'm going to point out as well. There's a range, again, as I either mentioned in the pre-show at the start of the show, in the Bible. In 1 Corinthians 5, which we'll read in a moment, Paul clearly identifies different types of fornication, some worse than others. It doesn't make any of them acceptable, but some are worse than others. No question about it. We'll talk about it in a moment. But it's important to keep that in mind. Fornication isn't just this one single act. You could take the two homos on the thumbnail to the show from the art in Pompeii. Right? They got an anal penetration. You got two men and a woman involved in a double anal act and homo. Right? So there's no benefit here. There's only damage to people's excretory organ, which is used to take out toxins that are harmful to our body. So the double sodomy is just damaging to people in terms of their ability to excrete toxic waste. There's no reproduction. That area of the body does not benefit from anal penetration. All kinds of problems and damage that is done. And the person who's anally damaging them is only experiencing a simulation of the same thing you get from normal vaginal sex. So it's damaging other people unnecessarily for their own selfish benefit. That's prohibited. That's not something the Bible presents as acceptable. That's in the definitions of porneia, as I'm going to show you in just a moment after we read this one text. We've already quoted fornication from just the standard English sources, right? Those do not represent what the Bible says in its totality, right? There's a basic element of consistency. That's it. So this text here, though, right, before we get to more on this definition of fornication or what the Hebrew and Greek words mean, 2 Samuel 5:13 says, "Meantime, David went on taking more concubines and wives out of Jerusalem after he came from Hebron. And more sons and daughters continued to be born to David." David was a man after God's own heart. And that doesn't mean he was perfect, because we know he wasn't. But there is nothing presented in the Old Testament that says these things are bad, that people who do them are committing fornication, or that David's committing adultery here because he's got more than one woman, right? If we go back to the Google definition, again, it just says intercourse between people not married to each other, or in the adultery, when one or more of the partners having consensual sexual intercourse is married to another person. So if two people have sex, if one of them is married to someone else, it would be considered adultery according to this Wikipedia definition. That's not what the Bible says. It doesn't say here that they're not. It says when they're married to another person, right? So in this sense, it seems like it would exclude, it would consider what David did adultery, because he's having consensual sexual intercourse while married to another person. So this it's very limited, right? But at least this is, I think, pretty common to what people think adultery is, and this also what fornication is. And while, again, there is an element of consistency, right? This idea of having relations with another person, but in the Bible, adultery involves leaving the one you're with for that other person. Next week. And fornication, well, I think there is a basic element here. Again, this whole idea of what is marriage, right? That would not apply to David, of course, having more than one woman. It says fornication is generally consensual sexual intercourse between two people, not married. But in David's case, right? So David had all those wives. And in the Bible, the wives are considered, like who you're primarily married to or in a relationship with. And the concubines were secondary. So this would not apply, right? Because you're not really married in the sense that you are to the wives, to the concubines. And so this definition doesn't consider that. It does say generally, and so that's a good qualification. Either way, very similar to this, sexual intercourse between people not married. Doesn't limit it to two right here. Okay, and this isn't, again, you have the whole marriage question. So I wanted to at least highlight so we understand what people are thinking, what we understand by these terms, which I think is pretty consistent with what you have here. All right, now we read what is true of David and others, right? Solomon. Let me read to you the definitions of the terms primarily translated fornication in the Bible, okay? There are some other terms or related words, but basically I'm going to keep it simple. And any other terms, I believe, would fall within the usage and meaning of the terms I'm going to share with you now. One of which is the term that we're primarily interested in because of the New Testament relationship, porneia, right? What is translated most often fornication in the New Testament, and also used in the Greek Septuagint translation of the Old Testament. But in the New Testament, right, Jesus gives that qualification. He says whoever leaves his wife for someone else, except for porneia, commits adultery. So that porneia is very important from a Christian perspective. And that porneia is what we're talking about today. Fornication, right? So these are the definitions of the terms in the Hebrew Bible that we're going to read first for fornication. Okay, this is from the Brown, Driver, and Briggs Hebrew English Lexicon, published by Hendrickson. I'm going to start on page 275, where on the right-hand column, it gives the definition of zanah, the Hebrew word for committing fornication, the verb. It says, zanah, commit fornication, be a harlot. Commit fornication. It cites various texts here from Genesis to Deuteronomy, Ezekiel, Judges, Hosea. We're going to be reading from these texts, most of which are cited right here. Be or act as a harlot. Cites a bunch of texts, right? Joshua, Ezekiel, Proverbs, Judges, Genesis. Against page 275, everybody. Brown, Driver, and Briggs. Under zanah, commit fornication of a woman's act, a land given to harlotry, a man's act, improper intercourse with foreign nations. Improper intercourse, harlotry, right? That's been a big part of these definitions and uses in the Brown, Driver, and Briggs lexicon. Of intercourse with other deities considered as harlotry, involving actual prostitutions. Exodus 34, Deuteronomy 31, Leviticus, Judges, 1 Chronicles, Ezekiel. Lewd women, of lewd women. Page 276. We're reading under the definition of the Hebrew verb zanah in the Brown, Driver, and Briggs lexicon standard source. In agreement with others, so I chose this one. It was the best one I felt and gave the most references and information. Cause to commit fornication, religious, sexual. And then under a related term, zenunim, very small print, but I can see it. Zenunim, page 276. Fornication. Zenut, that was the word I initially looked at, but it was the second one. The first one is zenunim. After zanah, it goes to zenunim. Then zenut, fornication, sexual, religious, international. Okay. So, and that's basically, there's another verb. There's a noun. Tainut, which is right below zenut. Both are nouns that looks like used abstractly for fornication. There's a note at the end of tainut. These are all international, mingled with religious references. Okay, but you see the basic understanding here, right? Harlotry. That to me is the primary association here. Commit fornication. Be a harlot. Improper intercourse with foreign nations. Their whorish heart. Ezekiel 6:9. So that's the Hebrew verbs and nouns. Now let's take a look at the Liddell Scott Greek English Lexicon for the Greek term porneia, used to translate most often the Hebrew terms for fornication we just read, and used in the New Testament in the key text for Christians in terms of what would be acceptable for leaving a relationship and things we're not supposed to do, right? Porneia. Acts of porneia. And I'll be reading from page 1450 on the right-hand side. Porneia. Prostitution. The very first definition, just like zana, fornication, be a harlot. Fornication, unchastity, idolatry, brothel. That would be parnaion. Prostitute, mostly of a woman, prostitute herself, be or become a prostitute. Fornicate, metaphorically practice idolatry. 1 Chronicles 5:25 it cites in the Septuagint. Harlot, parne, the related term, a noun, right? Hey, parne, the harlot. Prostitute. Of or for harlots. Keep up, oh, that's the next word. The next word below parneia is parnabaskaion, brothel. And then below that, you've got parnogenes, born of a harlot. And then you've got below that parnos, catamite, sodomite, right? Pedos, sodomites, idolater, fornicator. So parneia, parne, parnos, these all involve prostitution, harlotry, catamitism, sodomy. Let's just take a look real quick here and make sure. I'll bring you guys here. Let me show you real quickly here. So here you have the definition of catamite, in case you're unfamiliar with that. A boy kept for homosexual practices. So you've got the sodomy and the pedo there for parnos, related to parneia. A catamite, a sodomite, a homo. Okay, that's what these terms mean. These are the terms for fornication, harlotry, sodomite. They're all related. Pedo, catamite. All consistent with what we read about the Hebrew verb and noun for fornication or fornicate. Let's take a look at the New Testament, okay? This way we have our definitions clear in mind, and then we will read the texts. Parneia. In the Brown Driver Briggs Danker. I'm sorry. Bauer and Gingrich Danker. We read from the Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew lexicon earlier. This is the Greek source, or one of them. We just read from the Liddell Scott lexicon that has classical, New Testament, and Septuagint references and definitions. I'm reading from the Bauer, Gingrich, and Danker lexicon, page 854. Parneia, of various kinds of unsanctioned sexual intercourse. Unlawful sexual intercourse, prostitution, unchastity, fornication. It cites classical, lexical, and New Testament sources for these definitions. Be an illegitimate child, a bastard. Don't tell Sam that. Participation in prohibited degrees of marriage. Immorality of a transcendent nature. And under that it says, in imagery of polytheistic cult in the mystic city of Babylon. And then below that, also on page 854, but the right-hand column, parnuo, the verb. To engage in sexual immorality, engage in illicit sex, to fornicate, to whore. Engagement in polytheistic cult. And then below that it has parne, one engaged in sexual relations for hire, prostitute, whore. Parnas, one who practices sexual immorality. Fornicator, adulterer. That's what it gives under Parnas. A political entity hostile to God. Mother of fornicators, Revelation 7:15. Well, I mean, yeah, I think there's a political aspect to Babylon the Great, but we'll get to it. Okay. As you can see, the definitions of the biblical terms for fornicate or fornication primarily involve prostitution and harlotry, which includes male prostitutes and boys, little boys, and catamites, which are those who have young boys to sodomize, and so they're pedosodomites, and actual sodomites, like the male sodomites you see partially depicted on the thumbnail to this video. And you also have the male sodomy, right? The anal act is sodomy, and then the abuse that comes along with it. That is all a part of fornication in the Bible, according to the definitions we just read, but not included in the common English definitions we just read, or that probably most people commonly think of because of that very reason, the way it's been defined and used. Now, let's go to the Bible, okay? Let's go ahead and take a look at what the Bible says. What do the texts in the Bible tell us about fornication? Well, I'm going to show you. We're going to go over it right here. You ready? Oh, actually, let's do this first. One thing, let's go to a few initial texts. Matthew 5:32, right? This is why this is important, okay? It's important that we lay a quick foundation here. Let's do that in addition to the definitions we just gave. Let's take a quick look at some of these texts to show again why we're doing this, why it's important. Matthew 5:32. Jesus says, however, I say to you that everyone divorcing his wife or leaving his wife, except on account of fornication, porneia, makes her a subject for adultery. Because if you leave the woman you're with, she still belongs to you unless it involves porneia. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery, right? So a woman who has left her husband and there isn't a grounds for it, porneia, except on account of fornication, she's a subject of adultery. She is not supposed to be bound to another man. She's still bound to the other man. But even Jesus, right? Who did he talk to at the well? The Samaritan woman, right? How many husbands, how many men did she have? Yeah, quite a few. But it's not like Jesus avoided her like the plague, right? And totally was disgusted with her. It's not good. It's not what we want to see, obviously, right? Even the woman didn't seem to be too happy with her situation. But that's why Jesus recognized she was genuine, even though she had multiple men. And the one she was with at that time wasn't her real husband, according to Jesus. So something happened that didn't involve porneia. But it happens, everybody. We're not here to shun people and completely ignore them forever just because they're having a hard time sexually. Yeah, it's not good. It causes destruction. We should try to not have those things happen. But you know what? Like I said earlier, it's one of the most common, if not the most common problem we have. So this idea that somehow it's never going to happen, or that it's so bizarre you can't believe someone you know or you were involved with, hey, yeah, not a good thing. It can be avoided if you do certain things that today seem odd, because everybody today seems so involved with how they look and how people perceive them. It's only a matter of time before you get the attention that you're desiring in a way that you shouldn't be looking for in the first place, because if you were satisfied with where you were or who you were with, you'd be thinking about that person and about praising God and about bettering your situation there, not constantly seeking attention, whether you're a man or a woman, everywhere you go. Looking presentable, looking nice is fine, but there's certainly got to be a standard for Christians that you'll have to apply, right? I'm not here to judge you. I'm here to caution you, man and woman, that some of the things we do can create these problems. And sometimes there's nothing we can do. We have to move on and try to become a better person. But we have accounts like that where people, like the Samaritan woman, had multiple husbands. Not a good thing, but Jesus didn't condemn her. We have the adulteress in John 8 that we read about yesterday. Jesus didn't condemn her. He didn't approve of what she did, and he told her to stop doing it. He didn't condemn her. Everyone divorcing his wife except on the account of porneia makes her a subject for adultery. Whoever marries a divorced woman, we'll talk more about this adultery and the adultery text and words next Sunday. So this is obviously very important, though, isn't it? It's a grounds like I was talking about earlier. Let's go to Matthew 19. And in Christian relationships, with the prevalence of sexual things, right, it's going to come up. It's going to be an issue unless we work on it. Unless we're committed to being faithful. And when we're weak, helping each other. Oh yeah, this is not going to be easy. We have our own imperfections and sinful desires, and we have the devil, and we have all these things in the world. Let's stop pretending this is going to be easy all the time. And then we'll be better prepared, hopefully, to deal with it. Matthew 19, 9 through 11. I say to you that whoever divorces his wife except on the ground of porneia, fornication, and marries another commits adultery. The disciples said to him, as such is the situation with a man and his wife, it's not advisable to marry. He said to them, not all men make room for the same, but only those who have the gift. And I've talked about this in prior shows. Talked about, I believe, in part 1 of it, does the New Testament prohibit polygamy? That this can be translated, that who have the gift can be, it seems to me to mean whoever has the money. Yeah, not everyone can handle this. Not everyone can have it so that You're not able to leave your wife unless there's sexual perversion, harlotry, sodomy, pedo. We read the terms, everybody. Okay, this does not involve taking a woman, whether it's a wife or a concubine, to your home, according to the laws of the land and the Bible. It involves the kind of abusive sexual interaction that is common to prostitution, male and female, and pedo. So they understand that, right? Okay, well, we don't do that stuff really. You know, I mean, we do have multiple. Well, so if we bring a woman into our home and we don't like her, you mean we can't get rid of her unless there's this kind of perverted, abusive sexual act? Well, then what's the point of even bringing someone home, right? We can't get rid of them. In other words, they're having difficulty, it seems, being satisfied with the women they're bringing home, right? And so it seems like they're more apt to get rid of them. And he's saying, no, you can't do that. You can't leave your wife unless there's porneia. We read the definitions of porneia and related terms and the Hebrew term from standard lexical sources. None of them said anything about having more than one woman living with you at your home as part of your family. None of them. They all primarily focused around prostitution and abusive sexual practices involving people you don't bring home as part of your family. Let's go ahead and take a look at Hebrews 13:4, right? We're just laying a quick foundation to show, okay, why is this so important for Christians? You know, we thought fornication was pretty simple, Greg. Why you spend all this time? Well, it's not that simple, number one. And number two, it is that important, right? It's the only grounds upon which you can actually leave a person you have had relations with and that you're one with as part of your family home. It's very serious. Hebrews 13:4. Let marriage be honorable among all, and the marriage bed be without defilement, for God will judge fornicators and adulterers, right? We're talking about these today. We'll talk about those next Sunday. Obviously, again, this is important. How can we maintain honor? How can we make sure we're not violating things in ways that could be considered porneia, fornication, zana, Hebrew, or adultery that we'll talk about more next week? Well, that's what we're doing right now. We're trying to understand, right? What do we need to know about these terms so that we don't become liable to the master or one God the Father, right? This is our opportunity to show what we're about. And if we make mistakes, again, woman at the well, multiple husbands. One she's with now is not her husband. Woman that they brought to Jesus in John 8, caught her in the act. I don't condemn. Did they condemn you? No, I don't condemn you. Don't do it again. That's the biblical mentality. But that doesn't mean we go around tolerating, or Jesus didn't accept either one of those things. He understood, though, didn't he? That's who we are. Unfortunately, we're going to have some problems. Do we have to have ongoing? No, we can limit it. We can try to stop it. Don't act like this is so bizarre when it happens, or if it happens, that you just can't even believe it. Unbelievable, right? No, it's actually quite common. It's actually quite prevalent. We can try to stop it. We should try to fight it. We shouldn't be condemning each other. That's a fact. 1 Corinthians 4. Okay, and so this shows, again, the range I was talking about earlier. Before we get to the Old Testament on fornication, again, there's really not as many texts as you might think. I guess depends on what you expected, right? But we're going to hit the primary ones and most in the Old Testament. 1 Corinthians 4:21. What do you want? Shall I come to you with a rod or with love and mildness of spirit? Actually, fornication, porneia, is reported among you, and such fornication as is not even among the nations. Let's just make sure. Take a quick look here. Sorry, instead of pulling up the Bible Hub, because I don't think we're going to be using that as much, I'll just use my program real quick here. So you have porneia here. Such fornication as is not even among the nations, that a certain wife, we talked about this in part 2 of my Does the New Testament Prohibit Polygamy? That a wife, a certain man has of his father. And you are puffed up and did not rather mourn, or that the man that committed this deed should be taken away from your midst, right? He's not. He's upset here, right? He's got fornication beyond even the nations. Everybody, what does my thumbnail show that the nations were doing at this time in this century that he could be referring to? What is it? The nations, they were doing double anal, right? Double anal plus homo, while a woman's being abused in the act of prostitution. It's a depiction in Pompeii. That's what fornication is. And they were doing it even worse, right? You had the incestual component going on here. All right, so now let's go. Let's go to the Bible here. Let's go to the fornication texts in the Bible. Starting with Numbers. This is the first time I could show, and again, if I missed a reference or two, some I'm deliberately not including because they don't have enough contextual description or related information to really be useful. They just say fornication, and it doesn't really provide much information beyond that. These texts here, though, that I provided show what I've been talking about in terms of what the term means and how it's defined in these texts. So we're going to start in Numbers chapter 14. That's not going to help, is it? Numbers 14:28. Say to them, as I live is the utterance of Jehovah, if I shall not do to you just that way as you have spoken in my ears. Verse 29, in this wilderness your carcasses will fall, yes, all your registered ones of all your number from 20 years old upward, you who have murmured against me. This is before they entered the promised land. Verse 30, as for you, you will not enter into the land in which I lifted up my hand and oath to reside with you, except Caleb and Joshua the son of Nun. Verse 31, and your little ones, who you said would become plunder, these also I shall certainly bring in, right? Because they were worried about the people of the land. And they will indeed know that the land that you have rejected, Verse 32, but the carcasses of you yourselves will fall in this wilderness. Their lack of faith, right? Failure to appreciate Jehovah's provision to this point. And these people had a lot of problems, but he still brought them through from Egypt all the way to this point. And then their sons and others would receive the fulfillment. Verse 33, and your sons will become shepherds in the wilderness 40 years, and they will have to answer for your acts of fornication until your carcasses come to their end in the wilderness. So it says your acts of fornication here. And this is really the first reference I found in the Bible. So I wanted to share with it here, right? Showing again this is kind of like the references I didn't include as much, where there's not a lot of information, but it's the first one. And it just does show elements of not remaining, right? Not kind of like a prostitution or a leaving away for something else. Certainly when it came to their making a golden calf and stuff, right? That's one of the acts of their fornication, right? This prostitution with other gods. At least that's the connection I make with this reference here, consistent with the definitions we read earlier about the meaning of the Hebrew and Greek terms. Judges 18:29 through 19:2. Furthermore, they called the name of the city Dan by the name of their father, Dan, who had been born to Israel. Nevertheless, Laish was the city's name at first. Verse 30, after that, the sons of Dan stood up the carved image for themselves. And Jonathan, the son of Gershom, Moses' son, he and his sons became priests to the tribe of the Danites until the day of the land's being taken into exile. Verse 31, and they kept the carved image of Micah, which he had made, set up for themselves all the days that the house of the true God continued in Shiloh. Judges 19:1. Now it happened in those days that there was no king in Israel, and it came about that a certain Levite was residing for a time in the remotest parts of the mountainous region of Ephraim. In time, he took as a wife a concubine. So this is another example of where in the Bible you have wives differentiated from concubines. And in this case, a concubine being taken as a wife. Verse 2, Judges 19, and his concubine began to commit fornication against him. Finally, she went away from him to the house of her father at Bethlehem in Judah and continued there fully 4 months. All right, so it doesn't really tell us what this act was, but so he took this wife, this concubine as a wife, and she began to commit these acts of porneia, likely harlotry, it would seem to me, right, based on her prior role as a concubine, now as a wife. So probably she's prostituting herself like a harlot, like a concubine, more so than a wife. Although a concubine's still supposed to be with the man she's with, just not on the level of a wife. Either way, that might have contributed to some degree to this prostitution, it seems, against him. Acts of fornication, for sure, because they were done while she was still with him, and then she left to her father's house. So again, I found this reference important, though, because it involved a concubine who became a wife and then started doing these acts of seemingly prostitutive type behavior against her husband before leaving. 2 Kings 9:22, and it came about that as soon as Jehoram saw Jehu, he immediately said, is there peace, Jehu? But he said, what peace could there be as long as there are the fornications of Jezebel, your mother, and her many sorceries? Right? And Dada's here. See, Dada. Hey, Dada, good boy. It's all kind of a treat. It's like a rare sighting when Dada comes. He let us know. I don't know if you heard his little sounds, but he's very cute. Right, so we know Jezebel was totally insane, right? She prostituted herself with these false gods, right? And she misled many people because of her magic practicing and prostitution. So I'm hopefully starting to see, at least there's this implied sense of prostitution and harlotry in some of the references we start out with. And again, even if you go back to the one we read a moment ago in Judges, right? The concubine, it's in the context of these carved images, right? Where acts of prostitution were done regularly in a cultic sense. That kind of like what we also read in the definitions of the terms, where this harlotry and prostitution and these temple prostitutes would engage in acts that are not what the Bible defines as a relationship between a man and his wife or concubines as part of his family, right? You saw right here, you can be a man who takes a concubine as a wife, but then she can do things that are considered fornication, which are in the context of these false gods and likely temple prostitution. And then we have Jezebel right here, totally insane. Ezekiel 6:3, and you must say, O mountains of Israel, hear the word of the sovereign Lord Jehovah. This is what the sovereign Lord Jehovah has said to the mountains and to the hills, to the stream beds and to the valleys. Here I am. I'm bringing upon you a sword, And I shall certainly destroy your high places. And your altars must be made desolate, and your incense stands must be broken. And I will cause your slain ones to fall before your dungy idols. Idols used in these temple prostitutions and acts, likely, right, because of the homo, sodomite, male and female, right, the use of the anal, like you see on the thumbnail, right, 2 homos plus a prostitute getting anal, double anal, and homo. Dungy idols, right, because they're used in the sex acts involving the anal, the fecal matter, the abusive parts of sex that are kind of fecally, right? Dirty, dungy. That's why the NWT uses that, right? Crappy, to use a kind of more colloquial term. I don't want to use the S word, but either way, these were associated with all these unclean things and acts. And I'll put your carcasses put the carcasses of the sons of Israel before their dungy idols, and I will scatter your bones all around your altar. So very clearly, right, we can see we have this ongoing problem. And then in verse 9, that was verses Ezekiel 6, 3 through 5. And then verse 9, your escaped ones will certainly remember me among the nations to which they have been taken captive, because I have been broken up at their fornicating heart that has turned aside from me, in their eyes that are going in fornication after their dungy idols. Right? All in the context of what we've been reading, we read right here. And they will certainly feel a loathing in their faces at the bad things they have done and all their detestable things. Once again, we're getting fornication involved in harlotry and temple prostitution with dungy idols, high places where these poles were used, right? Similar to the poles you see today in a lot of these prostitution places, right? Phallic symbol. Ezekiel 23, verse 1, and the word of Jehovah proceeded to come to me, saying, Son of man, 2 women, the daughters of one another, there happened to be, and they began to prostitute themselves in Egypt. In their youth, they committed prostitution. I'll skip some of these things because it's a little more descriptive. And one of them began to prostitute herself, kept lusting after those passionately loving her. After the Assyrians, governors clothed with blue material, their deputy rulers, young men, all of them, cavalrymen. She continued giving forth her prostitutions upon them, with all those after whom she lusted, with their dungy idols, she defiled herself. Excuse me, verse 28, and her prostitution she carried from Egypt. They kept pouring out their immoral intercourse upon her. Right? So none of this involves a man living at home having more than one woman as a wife or concubine. Can we all agree on that? None of this that we've been reading involves that. Not one time. In the one time where the man in Judges made a concubine his wife, she then began committing acts of fornication against him and then left. In the context of similar things that we see here about temple prostitution and idols, fecal matter idols, right? Relationships with all these different people, like a prostitute, that has nothing to do with living at home with the man and providing children and supporting the family the way the most famous men of God did in the Bible. Ezekiel 23:17. And the sons of Babylon kept coming into her, to the bed of expressions of love, and defiling her with their immoral intercourse. She kept getting defiled by them, and her soul began to turn away, disgusted from them, right? And women, that's scientifically what's been shown to happen. You become desensitized. All this sexual intercourse with a man who's not your husband, or that you're living at home with as his wife or concubine in a biblical sense, it makes you disgusted at the man or men that you're with, right? If you're just with one man, that has not been shown to happen. Maybe it can, but it definitely happens when you're with multiple men who clearly don't care enough about you to make you their wife or have you live with them and take care of you and build a family. No way. Not even close. That's why the way the Bible describes these relationships is perfect. We're not perfect. We're sinful, so it's not always the way it should be. But it's way beyond and better in every way than this kind of thing that just ends up exposing you to higher risk and the men, and then neither of you really love each other at all. That's why you're constantly with other people. Right? Goes on to talk about acts of prostitution again in verse 18, 23, 30. There's a lot of references here in Ezekiel 23 that there will be a doing of these things to you because of your going like a prostitute after the nations, on account of the fact that you defiled yourself with their dungy idols. Ezekiel 43, verse 7. He went on to say to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne, the place of the soles of my feet, where I shall reside in the midst of the sons of Israel to time indefinite. And no more will they, the house of Israel, defile my holy name, they and their kings, by their fornication and by the carcasses of their kings at their death. They defiled my holy name by their detestable things. Now let them remove their fornication. Right? He's not talking about people like David who have women with him at his home, or Abraham or Isaac or Jacob. He's talking about people who defile his name by their fornication, the things we've been reading about relative to prostitution, with many men and women having relationships to the point where they end up disgusted with each other and abused. Hosea chapter 1. This is the last part. This is the final text we're reading in Hosea. It's mentioned a lot in Hosea, fornication. And then that's it, everybody. This is the end of the Old Testament uses of fornication, fornicator. For the most part, I might have missed a few, and I did omit several that don't have a whole lot of contextual material. Otherwise, this is it, everybody. Then we'll go to the New Testament and wrap it up. Fornication, adultery next week. Hosea chapter 1. There was a start of the word of Jehovah by Hosea. And Jehovah proceeded to say to Hosea, Go, take to yourself a wife of fornication and children of fornication, because by fornication the land positively turns from following Jehovah. So fornication is the thing that turns people away from Jehovah. It's not the thing that Jehovah ordains and approves and even brings together in multiple places and people in the Bible, involving one man and more than one woman. As we've talked about in the polygamy shows I mentioned before, there is a limitation in the New Testament for overseers and servants. That's it. And we do live according to the laws of the land. And I'm not here to promote anything but that, unless it directly contradicts something explicit in the Bible we're to do or not do. But I'm also not here to misrepresent the word fornication and only rely on sources like Google or other English texts like Merriam-Webster that don't provide a complete definition of what we see in the Bible, or even represent in its more abbreviated form or definition accurately what we see in the Bible. We follow the Bible, not later traditions that contradict it. So you can see here, obviously, that fornication being talked about is what would turn you away from following Jehovah. It does not include, as I mentioned before, and as we read about David, and as we read before in other videos, as you can see for yourself with people like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Solomon, many others, having more than one woman in a family sense with one man is not prohibited. Hosea chapter 2, and to her sons I will not show mercy, and they are all sons of fornication, for their mother has committed fornication. That she was pregnant with them has acted shamefully. I want to go after those loving me passionately, those giving my bread, my water, my wool, my linen. And she will actually chase after her passionate lovers, plural. But she will not overtake them, and she will certainly look for them, and she will not find them, and she will have to say, I want to go and return to my husband, the first one, for I had it better at that time than now. And while that may not always be an option for some of you women, certainly you can see here that's what ends up happening. You end up regretting the one you left, and it's very rare you find someone better. And in the Bible, there's plenty of examples of that, and in modern times, there's plenty as well. So whether that's the case for you or not, in the Bible, it's very clear we're talking about fornication involving multiple lovers for this woman that he's talking about, and that in many cases is metaphorical for Israel, but still, even in a direct sense, this is true, and it's consistent with what we've been reading, right? Fornication involving sexual acts that involve multiple people that aren't your husband that you're committed to and living at home with. Hosea 2:13, and I will hold an accounting against her for the days of the Baal images to which she kept making sacrificial smoke. And she kept decking herself with her ring and her ornament and going after her passionate lovers. And I was the one that she forgot, is the utterance of Jehovah. You will not benefit yourself long-term, and usually not even temporarily, except for a few moments of pleasure that you regret immediately, by pursuing these things, women. You can, if you want, knock yourself out. Do whatever you want. We're here to listen to what the Bible says and hopefully make the best decisions and work with people who feel the same way, right? We try not to get involved with people who are committed or involved with regularly sexual abusive practices. Now, things can happen, right? I mentioned people like the woman at the well or the woman who was caught in the act of adultery. They were not condemned. They were actually released by Jesus. That should be our attitude. And that doesn't mean we accept people who continuously do things that are damaging people in themselves. But we shouldn't be looking to condemn people because we might end up condemning ourselves. We should just try to help people, do the best we can. If someone won't listen, what does Jesus say in Matthew 18? Well, then stop going. Then treat them as someone of the nations. Be nice, say hi and bye, and don't get too involved. If they're not going to listen, if someone's going to keep getting involved with a prostitute and damaging that person and themselves, or other sexually abusive practices like sodomy, pedoism, or like you see on the thumbnail, the artwork from Pompeii, the 1st century, two homos sodomizing each other and a woman prostitute. There's nothing that supports that in the Bible. That's what the nations do. And in Corinthians, as we read, Paul was dealing with people there that were doing worse than that. So it's not a good thing, but we do need to try to work with people. We're sexual creatures. We're sinful. It's going to happen. It's not like so bizarre. It's like, oh my gosh, no, well, that can happen. We can do things to be careful. We should try. But let's be honest with ourselves. In fact, let me share an account with you that you may not know about. We're talking about this whole idea of fornication and how it seems to primarily involve this prostitution and harlotry of individuals, male and female, often related to a religious practice as well, an act, dungy idols, sacred poles, carved images, temple prostitutes, like you see reference even here in Genesis 38. But that doesn't mean that there can't be times when people make mistakes or do things, right? I mentioned the two women in the accounts in John. And look at this account here. Look at this account in Genesis 38 involving Judah, right? So even though it's pretty clear fornication involves having relations with people who are not your husband at home as part of your family, or your wives or concubines at home as part of your family, more like harlotry with multiple people in different ways that have a range of different types of behavior, like we see referenced by Paul in 1 Corinthians 5. Nevertheless, here, in addition to those two examples of the Samaritan woman and the woman in John 8, look at this account. Where do I want to start here? Verse 11, Genesis 38. So Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law. So here you have Judah, right? Son of Jacob. Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, dwell as a widow in the house of your father until Shelah, my son, grows up. For he said to himself, he too may die like his brothers. Accordingly, Tamar went and continued to dwell at her own father's house. So he's setting up an arrangement for his son. And then in verse 12, thus the days became many, and the daughter of Shua, Judah's wife, died. And Judah kept the period of mourning. After that, he went up to the shears of his sheep, he and Hirah, his companion, to Timnah. Verse 13, then it was told to Tamar, here, your father-in-law, Judah, is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. Verse 14, remember he told her earlier to go up to her father's house and to wait for him. With that, she removed the garments from her widowhood from her and covered herself with a shawl and veiled herself and sat down at the entrance which is along the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah had grown up, and yet she had not been given as a wife to him. So Judah hadn't yet given her to his son. So now she's removing the coverings of her widowhood because her husband had died. And she went and she sat along the entrance near the road to Timnah where Judah was going. And in verse 15, it says, when Judah caught sight of her, he at once took her as a harlot because she had covered her face. Verse 16, so he turned aside to her by the road and said, allow me, please, to have relations with you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. However, she said, what will you give me that you may have relations with me? Verse 17, to this Judah said, I myself shall send a kid of the goats from the herd. But she said, will you give me a security until you send it? Because he wants to have sex with her right now. Verse 18, and he continued, what is the security that I shall give you? To which she said, your seal ring and your cord and your rod that is in your hand, right? Because she wants to be able to prove later that he's the father. Because she knows she's not doing something right, but she wants to do it anyway. Some of you women, right? When you want something. Then he gave them to her and had relations with her, so that she became pregnant by him. Verse 19, after that she got up and went and removed her shawl off and clothed herself with the garments of her widowhood. So she went back to being like she was before this. Verse 20, and Judah proceeded to send the kid of the goats by the hand of the companion, right? Because she wouldn't have been able to prove by that security, by that gift. That's why she asked for the other stuff. In order to get back the security from the hand of the woman, right? He wants his stuff back, his seal ring and other stuff, right? Character stuff right there. Seal ring, Sam. But he never found her. Verse 21, and he went inquiring of the men of her place, saying, where's that temple prostitute that was along the road? But they kept saying, there's no temple prostitute here in this place. Finally, he returned to Judah and said, I never found her. This is his companion. And besides, the men of the place said, no temple prostitute has been in this place. So Judah said, let her take them for herself in order that we may not fall into contempt. At any rate, I've sent this kid, but you never found her, right? So he did what he was supposed to do. However, about 3 months later, it happened that it was told to Judah, Tamar, your daughter-in-law has played the harlot. And here's where the word fornication is used, or porneia, related term. And here she is also pregnant by her harlotry. Similar there. At that, Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. Right? So Judah doesn't know yet that she's pregnant by him. He just thinks she acted like a prostitute in violation of the law. Now, why would he get so upset by that when he just had relations with someone he thought was a prostitute? Because he's a man. And even though he technically committed an act of fornication by having relations with a prostitute that he didn't bring home as his wife, he wasn't considered subject to that the way the woman was. So it again shows, and one of the reasons I'm highlighting this in addition to the use of the terms for fornication, is to show the differences that existed between the men and the woman, between a woman having more than one man. In this case, she had already had a man and was supposed to be awaiting for his son to be ready. But he's thinking she went out and played like a harlot and had relations with someone who wasn't her husband and got pregnant by that man. And so he felt that gave him the right to put her to death. Whereas his involvement with the prostitute did not. Because he's the man. She's not with another man. She's just a prostitute. And while what he did was still fornication, I'm not saying it was a good thing, it is presented here in this account as something Judah did. So again, similar to the woman, the Samaritan woman having multiple husbands, the woman in John 8, the adulteress, the woman caught in the act, while these things are not acceptable, no one is saying that, at least that I'm aware of in our group, we do need to understand what these things mean, the accounts involving them, how we should try to deal with people who've committed these acts, while also holding them accountable. Now, it goes on to say, as she was being brought out, she herself sent to her father-in-law Judah, saying, by the man to whom these things belong, I am pregnant. And she added, examine, please, to whom do these belong? The seal ring and the cord and the rod. Judah stuff. Verse 26, then Judah examined them and said, she's more righteous than I am, for the reason that I did not give her to Shelah my son. And he had no further intercourse with her after that. So, just an interesting account in the Bible involving what is clearly fornication by someone we know well, Judah, but that nonetheless, even though it's wrong, was tolerated in a similar sense that Jesus tolerated the women who were caught in the act of adultery in John. So we need to understand this. We need to have a broad perspective. Be careful whom you condemn. Don't tolerate things that clearly are not good for you. We shouldn't do that either. We can do this. This is a fine line. We need to be understanding. We need to be loving, not judgmental, and not accepting of things that are bad for us. Right? We're not here to sanction things that are not good for you, even if we can tolerate people who practice them at times, or who make mistakes, or who are trying. Let's go back to the text involving fornication in the Bible, right? Okay. So we have these there's more. Hosea, like I said, is loaded with references to fornication in the context of, again, being treated like a harlot. Hosea 4:18, they have positively treated the woman as a harlot. Hosea 5:3, you've treated women like harlots. Hosea 5:4, the dealings do not permit a returning to God because there is a spirit of fornication in the midst of them, after multiple references to the woman being treated as a harlot and to her harlotry and prostitution, fornication. with her passionate lovers and false gods. The silver and gold which they made use of for Baal. Hosea 2:8. These are the references in the Old Testament, everybody. Everything I just read you. That's all of them. Again, a few, apart from a few where I don't think there's much to gain from reading them. Now the New Testament. Are you ready? We're going to wrap it up with this, and this is all of them, everybody. Again, except for the ones we already read, right? We read initially when we got started in this text review from Matthew 5, Matthew 19, Hebrews 13, and 1 Corinthians 4 and 5. I'm not going to reread those. So here in the New Testament, I mentioned I already read those. That's a note there. John 8:41. You do the works of your father. They said to him, we are not born from fornication. Porneia. We have one Father, God. And yet, most, if not all of these Jews in this account in John 8 were born directly from or part of a line of humans, men, that had multiple wives or women, wives or concubines. So are they saying they weren't born from marriages, right? My note here, many were born from polygamous marriages, which is clearly here not fornication to them. They're not born from fornication, the Jews who practiced the law that allowed for multiple wives and concubines. They're saying they're not born from what is fornication. So clearly that is not fornication. A man having multiple women at home, wives or concubines. Even in the New Testament, right? We saw that in the Old Testament clearly. Even with the case of Judah, where he committed fornication because the woman was a harlot and not his wife at home. The only difference, if he would have took that woman home, he couldn't, though, because he thought she was a harlot, and she didn't want him to either, because it was his daughter-in-law. She wanted to get pregnant by him. Right? So that was fornication. But if he would have taken her home, it wouldn't have been. That simple, right? Because it was a prostitutal, a harlot type relationship that's abusive and not something that God wants. It's not good for women or for men. Right? He almost had her burned to death wrongly because of his own sin. We already talked about Does the New Testament prohibit polygamy? Parts 1 and 2. The prohibitions in Acts 15 and 21, none of which involve having more than one woman at home in a biblical sense. We already talked about 1 Corinthians 5:1, the multiple types of fornication from the nations, like you see depicted on the thumbnail, from artwork during the first century when that was written, and what Paul describes as an incestual type of fornication. 1 Corinthians 6:13, foods for the belly for foods. God will bring both it and them to nothing. Now the body is not for fornication, but for the Lord, and the Lord is for the body. But God raised the Lord, and will raise us up out of death through his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of the Christ? Shall I then take the members of the Christ away and make them members of a harlot? Never made that happen. Members of a harlot. Body is not for fornication. Do you see a consistency here with everything we just read in the Old Testament and the repeated association, including the account involving Judah, with prostitution and harlotry and dungy idols and male and temple prostitutes involved with the worship of Baal in the high places, with the carved images and the sacred poles? All this sexually abusive and symbolic stuff. That's what fornication is. It's the same thing here. We not only saw that from John 8 and the other texts we've read already from Acts and 1 Corinthians and the others from Hebrews, the book of Hebrews 13. Verse 16, 1 Corinthians 6, what do you not know that he who is joined to a harlot is one body. The two, says he, will be one flesh. The two become one Trinitarians. You don't have that in Deuteronomy 6:4. So stop lying, okay? But he who is joined to the Lord is one spirit. Flee from fornication. Every other sin that is a man may commit is outside his body, but he that practices fornication is sinning against his own body. Right? When you anally penetrate someone or are anally penetrated, that's damage, immediate and direct, and maybe even permanent. Or when you do various other things that are damaging and destructive to a person's health and body, that is abuse. From prostitution to anal, which often prostitution can involve, like we see in the thumbnail. Double anal plus homo. That's abuse. That's damaging. That's not good for you. That's not what the Bible describes. That's porneia. That's zana. Zenunim. The Hebrew terms we read. The Greek terms we read. The text we've been reading. They all are saying the same thing, everybody. I already discussed 1 Corinthians 7. You can see, does the New Testament prohibit polygamy part 2 for more on that. 1 Corinthians 10:8, neither let us practice fornication, as some of them committed fornication, only to fall 23,000 of them in one day, referring to the Old Testament account, which does not involve people being killed for having more than one woman, wife, or concubine at home in a biblical sense. Ephesians 5:5, for you know this, recognizing it for yourselves, that no fornicator or unclean person or greedy person, which means being an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of the Christ and of God. Now, I wrote here, compare Matthew 8:11, which reads, but I tell you, many from eastern parts and western parts will come and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of the heavens. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all had multiple women as part of their family, by whom they had children. It says no fornicator has any inheritance in the kingdom of the Christ and of God. And yet Jesus says many are going to recline with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of the heavens. Clearly, a fornicator is not someone who has multiple women, wives or concubines, in a biblical sense. Is that not clear? I think it is. 1 Thessalonians 4:3, for this is what God wills, the sanctifying of you, that you abstain from fornication. That each one of you should know how to get possession of his own vessel in sanctification and honor, not in covetous sexual appetite, such as also those nations which do not know God. We're clearly talking about things like we see on the thumbnail, are we not? Direct reference to the nations, covetous sexual appetite. That's what is described in connection with fornication in this text. 1 Timothy 1:5, really the objective of this mandate is love out of a clean heart, out of a good conscience, and out of faith without hypocrisy. By deviating from these things, certain ones have been turned aside into idle talk, wanting to be teachers of the law, but not perceiving either the things in the law, the things they're saying, or the things about which they're making strong assertions. Now, we know that the law is fine, provided one handles it lawfully. In the knowledge of this fact, the law is promulgated not for a righteous man, but for persons lawless and unruly, ungodly and sinners, lacking loving kindness and profane, murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, manslayers, fornicators, men who lie with males, kidnappers, liars, false swearers, and whatever other things in opposition to the healthful teaching, according to the glorious good news of the happy God to which I was entrusted. Very clearly here, it speaks about the law being promulgated against these things, does it not? And none of them involve having multiple women who live at home with their wives or concubines. It references fornicators, but that couldn't possibly be having more than one woman who lives at home with you as a wife or concubine, because that was acceptable according to the law. You want to be teachers of the law, but you don't understand the law, right? Law is fine if you handle it correctly, but it's against these things. It's not against having more than one woman at your home. So it couldn't possibly involve fornicators here. We're almost done, everyone. Jude 1, 7, and 8. So too Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them, after they in the same manner as the foregoing ones had committed fornication excessively, gone out after flesh for unnatural use, are placed before us as a warning example by undergoing the judicial punishment of everlasting fire. In like manner, notwithstanding these men too, indulging in dreams, are defiling the flesh and disregarding lordship and speaking abusively of glorious ones. Again, the context here, Sodom and Gomorrah, we're talking anal there. Abusive sex, right? Raping, wanting to rape the angels, this terrible stuff, sodomites, flesh for unnatural use. Clearly, we are not talking about fornication, meaning a man living at home with a woman, either as a wife or a concubine in a biblical sense. Revelation 2:13, I know where you're dwelling. Jesus to the Christians, the first century. That is where the throne of Satan is. And yet you keep holding fast my name. And you did not deny your faith in me, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, the faithful one, who was killed by your side, where Satan is dwelling. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you, that you have there those holding fast the teaching of Balaam, who went teaching Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols and to commit fornication. Again, this temple prostitution, sacrificing arrangement with respect to false gods, like we read throughout the Old Testament references to fornication. So you also have those holding fast the teaching of the sect of Nicholas likewise, which is considered to be a group of people who practice this kind of abusive sexual, non-biblical, one man living at home with multiple women or wives or concubines. So these are explicit references to the type of fornication he is telling them not to commit in association with these sacrificial type, prostitutal, spiritual or physical roles or activities. Revelation 2, 19 through 23, we're almost done. I know your deeds, your love, your faith, your ministry, and endurance, that your deeds of late are more than those formerly. Nevertheless, I hold this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel. We read about her and her fornication practices, her sorceries, her prostitutions, her sacrificial smoke, and all the things that are associated with the things she did. The use of idols, the sacred poles, the false worship. Who calls herself a prophetess. She teaches, misleads my slaves to commit fornication. Anything sacrificed to idols. Again, this prostitution, false worship in association with Jezebel. I gave her time to repent. She's not willing to repent of her fornication. I'm going to throw her in a sick bed, and those committing adultery with her into great tribulation unless they repent. And her children I will kill with the deadly plague, right? Like we see ravaging many homos and fornicators today who are involved in this prostitution type arrangement. Exceptions aside, like with Judah, the Samaritan woman of John 8, things we may at times do that are not correct. But this way of life, this repeated involvement with this type of non-biblical sexual relationship with people that does not involve living at home with one man and multiple wives or concubines, if that's the arrangement, in a way that is not abusive and involves the worship of false gods or these type of prostitutal acts. Last verses. Revelation 17, he carried me away in the power of the Spirit into a wilderness, and I caught sight of a woman sitting upon a scarlet-colored wild beast. It was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, and had in her hand a golden cup that was full of disgusting things, and the unclean things of her fornication. Do you think that involves this great slut living according to what the Bible describes as a man with multiple women, wives, or concubines, like David, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Solomon, and others who will be reclining with us at the table in the kingdom of the heavens? I don't think so. Verse 5, and upon her forehead was written a name, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of the harlots, the mother of sluts, and of the disgusting things of the earth. That has nothing to do with the approved biblical relationships involving one man and multiple women or wives, if that's the agreed upon arrangement for non-overseers and servants as Christians. Revelation 18:3, for because of the wine and of the anger of her fornication. Now, we've got angry fornication here. This slut is very angry with her. She's committing fornication with the kings of the earth, multiple men. Very damaging and abusive. She doesn't care. She's the great slut, everyone. She is promoting her harlotry and disgusting behavior, her fornication with the kings of the earth, her abusive acts, probably sodomy in the spiritual sense, Revelation 18:9, the kings of the earth committed fornication with her. Right? Fornication includes the sodomy, pedo, all the things we read earlier from the standard lexical sources, the text we've been reading. Temple prostitutes, male and female, worship of Baal, carved image, sacred pole, all the stuff, Jezebel. She committed fornication with all these kings of the earth. Revelation 19:1 and 2, after these things I heard was a loud voice of a great crowd in heaven saying, great crowd, they said, praise Jah, you people. The salvation and the glory and the power belong to our God, because his judgments are true and righteous, for he has executed judgment upon the great harlot who corrupted the earth with her fornication, porneia, and he has avenged the blood of his slaves at her hand. That is not talking about what the Bible describes faithful servants of God doing in accordance with the law or outside of the law, in ways approved by God if not brought about by God, and consistent with what we see in the Old Testament illustrations and accounts from Jesus to Paul, not involving overseers or servants. Revelation 21:7 and 8, anyone conquering these things, I shall be his God and he will be my son. But as for the cowards and those without faith and those who are disgusting in their filth, and murderers and fornicators and those practicing spiriters and idolaters and all the liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, that means the second death. Right? Clearly the fornicators here, as we've seen throughout this discussion and review of the Bible and fornication, involves people who are disgusting in their filth, murderers, spiritistic practicers, and idolaters, not people like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who had multiple women, and who, according to Jesus, will be reclining at the table in the kingdom of the heavens. Last verse, Revelation 22:14 and 15. Thank you for joining me or watching me later. I hope it's been informative, educational, uplifting. I know it takes a little time. We're here to do serious study of the Bible and to do it right and to get everything considered that's important to consider. That's why we do this, everybody. No other reason. We want you to be informed, educated, and to understand these things. Plus, when they come up, I can refer people to the video and not have to discuss it again and again, right? Same with you. Revelation 22:14, 15, last text. Happy are those who wash their robes, that the authority to go to the trees of life may be theirs, and that they may gain entrance by the city, into the city by its gates. I believe talking here about the nations on the earth during the millennial reign. The great crowd of Revelation 7 who enter into the new earth are ruled over by those in New Jerusalem with the Son, the 144,000 spiritual ones. And these are the nations that are eating from the leaves of the trees that are growing down from along each side of the river that flows from the throne of God and the Lamb. He's saying here, if you wash your robes, you can get entrance into the city. You can get entrance into the tree of life, which is where I already am with the 144,000. You're on the earth as the nations who've been blessed by my Father because of how you treated my brothers during the Great Tribulation. You've been blessed to enter into this period and to eat of the leaves of the trees. But if you continue washing your robes and eating from the leaves of the trees, is how I understand it contextually, you're going to get authority to go to the tree of life that's in the city. You're going to get entrance by the gate. Outside are the dogs, those who practice spiritism, and the fornicators, and the murderers, and the idolaters, and everyone liking and carrying on a lie. We don't want to lie about fornication, do we? We don't want to lie about anything. We want to, if we're biblical in our mindset and Christian, we want to understand these things. Clearly, Revelation 22 and 21 are not talking about people like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and others who had multiple women and wives, were approved by God, if not brought about by God, who weren't overseers or servants in a Christian sense, and who Jesus says are going to be reclining with us in the kingdom of the heavens. It's not talking about them, is it? No, it couldn't be. And none of the other descriptive references that we read from the Old Testament to the New, and the lexical sources that define the biblical words that we were reading, they're all consistent, everybody. Fornication is abusive sexual practices that could involve forcing yourself on other people, like we talked about in part 2 of Does the New Testament Prohibit Polygamy? Forcing yourself on someone in a way that the Bible says you're not supposed to do. That's not described as approved. It's disapproved by Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, where he talks about fornication and other things, and allowing people, doing it with mutual consent. Fornication is sodomy, anal sex, with a boy, with another man, or with a woman. It's involved with harlotry and prostitution, which is a woman having multiple men without being their woman or concubine at home, or a man having relations with that woman, like we saw with Judah. That's what fornication is. And that's the grounds you have if you're with someone living at home as man and woman, to leave them if they do those things. I hope it's been educational. I hope the analysis of these texts has helped you understand fornication better in the Bible. May we all do our best to try to live according to the way the Bible describes is best for men and women to live. If it's legal in your area for a man to live according to the Bible and have more than one woman as a wife or a concubine, I don't have a basis for judging you. If you're not a servant or an overseer in a Christian sense, you're still going to be judged for what you do. But as long as what you're doing is consistent with the Bible and the laws of the land, we'll work with you to praise Jah, honor the Messiah, and follow the golden rule. I'll see you all again soon. Feel free to join me next week as we discuss adultery in the Bible in CWJah Talk number 50.